And we are ready to talk about the macroeconomic impact from the budget 2018 and its key highlights today. And we have Thilina Panduwawala representing Frontier Research. Good evening to you, and we warmly welcome you on board.
Nice to be on the show.
Right. So shall we start our conversation by talking about the key highlights?
With regards to the budget 2018, one of the key highlights was the fact that the government had a broad framework of liberalization in the budget, which is in line with its Vision 2025 targets as well. This broad framework of liberalization has been pushed by the minister and the state minister in post-budget forums as well, and they seem to be adamant on pushing forward this, and this is in line with the fact that they want to open up the economy to export orientation and away from the inward orientation that it has had in the past. In addition to that, the government has also moved forward with the fiscal consolidation, partly because of the fact that it is a requirement considering the debt repayments that the government has to handle, and also the fact that the IMF program has fiscal consolidation as part of its requirements. And this has meant that there is realistic expectations from the government side, especially in revenues, which is a positive compared to past budgets. And finally, of course, considering the government's also heading into local government elections, it's nice to see that the government has not put focus on the elections through the budget, and that is a positive for businesses going forward, that there is some certainty the government is going for long-term policy consistency rather than the short-term election concerns.
Right. There were a number of revenue proposals in the budget speech this time, and there were certain instances where certain sectors were taxed. So how realistic are these tax revenue proposals?
The most obvious ones and the ones that were caught in the headlines was mainly the debt repayment levy that was on the banking sector, and also the telecom tower levy that is on the telecommunication sector. And in addition to these, there were changes to the alcohol taxation and also two changes in the motor vehicle taxation. The factor in these revenue proposals is that these are mainly indirect taxes. And so when we do look at these proposals, in fact, the indirect proposals mean that they're easier for revenue collection. That means the government will have an easier time collecting these revenues as compared to direct taxes. Longer run, with the new Indian revenue bill coming in, that is the direct taxation movement that the government wants to go into. However, in the short run, with regards to the government's revenues over the next year, the fact that these are indirect revenue proposals is a positive for the numbers with regards to revenues.
Right. So do the realistic expectations in the overall numbers carry on to the budget expenditure proposals?
So in the budget speech, there were about 200 individual budget proposals, promises put forward, and this encompassed about 10% of total expenditure of the government for 2018 as proposed. This is usually something that's in Sri Lankan budget and even in other emerging developing country budgets, where there are a lot of proposals. And the bottom line is whether the government's able to implement these 200 odd proposals, in which there are quite good proposals that if implemented will have good economic impact. So the issue with regards to realism of these proposals is again implementation, and how this implementation will happen, because the government also faces constraints going forward because of operationally and also with regards to political capital. So how the government will handle those constraints moving forward will matter with regards to these proposals. Operational capability, mainly how the government, considering the fact that sometimes the basics have not always been implemented so that with certain events in the past few months, how it gets those basics together and also uses its limited, especially the team in the finance ministry has done a good job, but how they work with the other ministries, other government institutions to push and implement these proposals will be important. And on the political capital side, there are some important proposals such as raising equity capital for the Bank of Ceylon and People's Bank, which are likely to face some political opposition from unions, from opposition parties. So how the government, the state banks, which will be shown as sale of state assets. So how the government moves ahead with such challenging proposals, which are positive for the economy, how that implementation is done will be important going ahead, and how that is handled will determine how effective these proposals will be.
Right, so there were a number of interesting proposals in the budget speech, ranging from blue-green economy to enterprise Sri Lanka. So how will these initiatives affect the economy?
It's interesting to see the government taking a long-term view with regards to the economy through things like a blue-green economy, looking at environmental sustainability, because for things like tourism, environmental sustainability is going to be a very key factor for Sri Lanka. And of course, on the other hand, the enterprise Sri Lanka proposal, which is to improve the entrepreneurship and also to drive exports. However, with regards to these proposals, it's about implementation, how the government manages its short-term requirements with these long-term visions. Because in the short term, it also needs to take into consideration that there are national elections in 2020. And what we do see in our outlook is how it manages these political and electoral pressures, as well as this requirement to address these long-term requirements to take Sri Lanka into the next growth level that the government promises through its Vision 2025, because in its targets it needs to push into 5 billion in FDIs by 2020 and to make Sri Lanka an upper middle income country. So for that, it's again, as I mentioned earlier, implementation. Implementation is going to really matter from the operational capabilities and the political capital, which are the constraints the government faces, and how it's going to manage these two will really matter with regards to these long-term visions that it's put forward, such as the blue-green economy, entrepreneurship, enterprise Sri Lanka, and also consistency. These proposals need to be carried on to the next budget. We need to see this in budget 2019, how these proposals are carried forward, how allocations are done. Because that consistency is lost, then of course these long-term visions will not be capable of being achieved.
Right, so you just mentioned about the importance of implementation of these budget proposals. So what are the areas what are the areas that should be given priority, or we expect priority to be given in terms of implementing? Yes.
Actually, post-budget, I think Mr. Panduwawala at one of the post-budget forums highlighted that they are looking at 5 key priorities that they want to work on going forward to implementation, understanding the constraints, and that is a positive going forward. What are the proposals that the government should prioritize? We actually looked at the 200 odd proposals, and we did come up with about 10 proposals the government really needs to push forward on. One of those is, of course, the budget implementation monitoring unit, which, if done, is good. It's a positive, because Sri Lanka's budgets are put out there, and then the implementation is not assessed. And this was actually discussed quite a bit prior to the budget announcement on November 9th, with research being done into how much of these proposals have been implemented. And that research that was made public showed that implementation was quite weak in Sri Lanka's budgets, even the previous budget. And with regards to that, so the budget implementation unit would be quite a positive for that, and if they is actually done properly. In addition to that, there is a central PPP unit. If that is done properly and is done functionally and works with the other aligned ministries to bring public-private partnerships together, it will drive the FDI requirements the government has highlighted, that 5 billion mark that they want to reach by 2020, which is ambitious. It can actually move forward if the PPP unit is properly functional. In addition to that, there is, of course, these highlighted allocations for a national window for 31 institutions to be connected, so that exporters and businesses would find it easier to work with the national institutions. Again, it needs to be implemented and it should be done in a workable manner, and if those kind of things are worked on, it will be easier for with regards to business and ease of doing business. In addition to that, we also looked at, again, the other one has been the equity capital, raising equity capital for the state banks, which will be important considering that they need to reach the Basel III capital requirements in the next few years. And of course, things like the legislative reforms that the minister actually promised in at the start of the budget speech, especially the liability management act that it needs to bring in, because with the 2019 being a high debt repayment year, it wants to borrow early next year so that it has space for those repayments. But it's only possible to borrow beyond the borrowing limit if it is able to pass these reforms. In addition to that, there's also the customs ordinance reform that it needs to carry out. And if these reforms are focused on, if these proposals are focused on with the operational issues as well as the political capital, it can manage these constraints properly and move forward, then yes, those are the priority areas the government needs to be looking at.
Right. Also, are there any sectors that have been neglected this time or should have been focused more?
What our sector research team has highlighted is that compared to the past, the amount of focus on sectors is actually reduced, and the number of proposals, and the proposals have been much more specific on the sectors. Things like tourism have seen not major proposals that are like major game changers, but mainly smaller proposals such as the informal market and also things like lifeguard. So this is not really an ignoring of these sectors, but rather the government being much more realistic with regards to the proposals that it can carry out.
All right, so thank you very much for being with us today and for your valuable insights, Thilina.
Thank you very much.
With that, we got to wind up for today. Thank you for being with us. We will see you next week. Take care and good night.